Call him Joe, an ordinary name for a man who wouldn't play their game. He walked the halls of power and of might, just looking for a sliver of the light. Inside the belly of the beast he saw a disregard for ethics and for law. He gathered papers, stacking fact on fact, knowing there was no turning back. He's an agent for the truth, standing tall, ready to answer freedom's call. They build the walls, but he'll just tear them down, wearing honesty like it's a crown. Filed the report, laid it on the stone, a heavy truth you can't ignore alone. The silence from the top was cold and deep, while the secrets they were trying to keep. He's an agent for the truth, a standing tall, ready to answer freedom's call. They build the walls, but he'll just tear them down, wearing honesty like it's a crown. An agent for the truth, just an agent for truth.
I'd like to welcome everyone to our show number 3. We always look to Almighty God for his blessing on our efforts, so we're going to pray the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Well, everyone, I want to welcome you to another edition of our collaborative show. We've got four of us tonight to share information back and forth with you. We have attorney Larry Beecraft, Freedom Law School founder and president, Paymon Montejede. Sean O'Connor's also here, but he's going to come in a little bit later during the Q&A. Myself, Joe Bannister. Larry, to find out more about him, you can type in Beecraft Briefs or the Dixieland Law Journal into any search engine. I like Start Page myself. Paymon is at livefreenow.org. Sean O'Connor is at seanoconnor.org. Another host that's not with us, Jim with Northwest Liberty News. That's northwestlibertynews.com. And we also have agentfortruth.com is my website. So tonight we're going to go for about 90 minutes in total, and there'll be a couple brief intermissions in between the segments. Now in the first segment, Paymon is going to lead a fascinating discussion regarding a very unique and interesting dialogue that he had with a law professor, a very prestigious law school. So you're going to be quite fascinated what the law professor did say in his conversation with Paymon and what he also didn't say, or at least what he chose to remain silent about. In the second segment, Larry's going to dig a little deeper into the history of the federal income tax with specific focus on the taxation of wages and salaries and the taxation of fringe benefits and other gains associated with wages and salaries. And you'll find that the devil is in the details, ladies and gentlemen. So we want you to pay close attention to the show. The third segment, we're going to have a Q&A. So you can look at your control panel and see that there's a place there where you could submit questions. So you've got a whole hour to do that. And of course, try to pay as close attention to our presentation as possible. But of course, if you have a question that comes up, you could type it into your computer and then copy and paste it into the questions section of your control panel. So what we're going to start with is a little video that's illustrative of this income tax reward that Freedom Law School has offered for quite some time. Paymon's going to get a little more into that, but we're going to go ahead and play this video. So here we go.
Sound is missing, Joe. This video, folks, is about Freedom Law School's $300,000 income tax reward, and also Joe Bannister, which many of you know, was former IRS special agent with the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division. It's a nice little introduction to the subject of the income tax fraud that you can share with your friends, family members, co-workers easily. You can just email to them, put it on your Facebook page, and challenge them to collect the $300,000 income tax reward of freedom loss. There's music in the background of this, which is not on right now, they didn't play, but does have become a nice background music also to make it more interesting.
That's right. And I'm going to point out that there's some parts of that video, at least the what's written there on the screen, that I'm not really very happy about because I don't think it's accurate. So take the information there with a grain of salt. There's a lot of good information on there, provocative, it makes people think. It's certainly the production quality of the video as a whole is great. But when they talk about 4 separate lawsuits and there's things that just aren't accurate as far as my particular circumstances. So we're going to have to talk about that another time. But Paymon, why don't you go ahead and talk about this really incredible dialogue that you had with a law professor, and then we'll join Larry for the second half of the show, or second segment of the show. So go right ahead, Paymon.
Well, folks, tonight what Larry and I will be doing is giving you a quick introduction as to why the whole income tax system is a fraud. Let's face it, the income tax is imposed on people's labor. Most Americans, they make their living and pay income tax on the wages and salaries that they have from their job. Well, in this presentation, we will show you by the law, 100% clear, that your wages and your salary are not subject to the income tax. That Congress of the United States never, ever in modern history passed a law that requires you to file and pay income tax. Never impose the tax on you, the average American wages, salary. So keep that in mind, folks, because you're going to get into a rabbit hole deeper and deeper as we go on. Now, what you saw and what you see on my screen is the Freedom Law School's $300,000 income tax reward. And so I had a dialogue with a law professor that he wanted to make a claim on Freedom Law School's $300,000 income tax reward, which is actually 3 separate $100,000 reward. We're going to focus on the first one tonight, which basically is about how the average American is not required to file and pay the federal income tax. Okay, of course, here's a page. You see that at livefreenow.org, Freedom Law School's page. You go under education materials and you go down to income tax reward. So here it is, folks, on the Freedom Law School's website, livefreenow.org, under education materials, you go down to income tax reward, and there you find this page, and that's where the reward is, and that's where you saw the video that you saw is also listed. And so the first 100,000, as you see here, is show what statute written by Congress of the United States that requires Americans to file an income tax confession or return and pay an income tax, which of course most Americans get their income in the ordinary meaning of the word income I'll talk about from wages and salaries. So I'll show you tonight with Larry how this all a bunch of fraud. So you go down on this page, you see the income tax fighting match between Paymon Motahede versus Jonathan Siegel. And you click on that, and you see, of course, you see Mr. Jonathan Siegel's picture here, and you see my picture next to him. You click on that dark blue link, and it takes you to the page that shows the email conversation between myself and Professor Siegel about this issue. First, I'm going to click on Professor Siegel's page to show you what it looks like. This is his page, folks. He's, as you can see on this page, with the George Washington University of Law, and it describes his affiliation in the past. He was a member of the appellate staff of the Civil Division of the U.S. Department of Injustice. Okay, that means he was one of those lawyers that argued cases before, or written legal briefs before the federal courts of appeal, which is one level below the U.S. Supreme Court. So he was not some small chunk before he became a law professor. And this school is one of the top 10 law schools in the whole country. So we're talking about a top tier law school professor who claims to be expert on the income tax and exposing what he calls fraud of people like us that claim that the average American is not required to file and pay the federal income tax. Someone pointed out Professional's website, and I'm going to show you the website right now of him, in which he, as you see on top of the page, he says income tax myth. There is no law requiring you to pay federal income tax, right? And it says below that the most basic myth of tax protesters, the label they try to put on us, is that there is simply no law mandating the payment of income. Tax protesters frequently say, quote, if only someone would show me the law that says I have to file a tax and pay taxes, I'd be happy to do it. Okay. And it says, okay, here are the laws that impose an income tax on requiring you to file an tax return and require you to pay taxes. So you can, this is whole thing. He's got a lot of, but when I came across this, I wrote to him and I told Professor Siegel, Dear Professor Jonathan Siegel, on April 20th, 2016 at 8:12 p.m. in the evening. I know you must be a very busy professor of law at George Washington University Law School, and I do not wish to take too much of your time. Someone led me to your post at your website, which had part of IRS Code Section 1 listed, which describes gross income. I found it odd that Section 1 specifically lists a few forms of income that very few people have and are usually in small amounts, such as royalties and fringe benefits, but do not list the most common and largest forms of income that most Americans have, namely wages and salaries. Did I miss something here? How could congressmen and their team of lawyers forget about wages and salaries? But remember to list royalties and fringe benefits. So I'm going to click on Section 61, folks, and that we're talking about here to see it for yourself. You see it right here. This is from on the top left is from Cornell Law School, the big law school out there. They put a lot of free laws for free on the internet for everybody to read for themselves. See, here is 26 USC Code Section 1 gross income defined. Let me tell you what that is. Federal law is in 4 different categories. Each category is a title. Title 26 or Category 20 is on tax. So that's why you see here 26 denote that. U.S. Code means United States Code. That means the codes of the federal law. So again, Category 26 of the federal law is on taxes. This is the book that has all that tax laws in it. Within this category or title, there are over 7,000 sections and much more sub sections. Here we have Section 61 defines what's gross income, because gross income is where the whole taxable income comes from. You got to have gross income to have taxable income. If you have no taxable income, you are not required to file, nor are you required to pay an income tax. So gross income is a key starting point that I will show you goes up to the heart of this fraud that the IRS and U.S. Department of Injustice, deep state management, has been illegally imposing on innocent American people, reducing you to a slave in cahoots and conspiracy with a bunch of crooked and wimpy federal district court and appellate judges as well. So you be the judge of the law, folks. We're going to read the law itself. So as you see right here, it says Title 26 Code Section 61, gross income defined, except as otherwise provided in the subtitle. Gross income means all income from whatever source derived, including the following item. The word in parentheses, but not limited to, folks, in law, it has no meaning. It has no meaning. Now, someone added that. They don't write stuff in a law in parentheses. You can ignore the language, but not limited to there to begin with. So here we go. Items of income are 1, compensation for services, including fees, commissions, fringe benefit, and similar items. You see, Congress says similar item to cover something like not limited to, cover a lot more in here. Similar item adds a few more things in there. Also, 2, gross income derived from business, gains from dealing in property, interest, rents, royalties, dividends, and you see there's 15 different items of gross income listed here, and what is glaringly apt is wages and salary. Don't you think that's important? Don't you think Congress should have listed the largest source of income of most Americans if they wanted to tax that? So that is a question, folks, that basically got brought to Professor on April 20th at evening, and next morning, the 21st of April at 10:44 a.m., he provided me a quick response. Professor Siegel said, Mr. Mutahede, thank you for your message. Wages and salaries are covered under Section 61, first item, as you are part of compensation for service listed in that item. John Siegel. Well, in this presentation tonight, you'll be shown that that's a lie and that's a fraud conclusively. And we may, of course, need to go to another conference call of one of these presentations to cover it in more detail, but you're going to see that tonight very clearly for yourself. So on April 21st, Thursday afternoon, I wrote Professor Siegel, thank you for your prompt reply. I apologize for not making my question clear to you. Item 1, compensation for services, lists fees, commissions, which are far less common form of compensation of most Americans, and then far less total dollar. Item 1 even lists fringe benefit. A fringe benefit is usually an extra small item that a salaried employee or an hourly wage earner is given. Fringe benefit, by its definition, is a fringe, an extra, the icing on the cake. The cake is the salaried or wage income. My question is, how could Congress and their team of lawyers remember to list fees and commissions, which are less common forms of compensation? And most particularly, how could Congress remember to list fringe benefit in item 1, which is the icing on the cake, but forgot to list wages and salaries, which is the cake itself, the most common form of compensation that most Americans receive, and is the highest total dollar compensation received in America by Americans, right? Thank you for taking your time to review my email question and enlightening. Folks, I'm always open to being corrected and learning, and I hope you are too. And here's the response of Professor Siegel. On April 26, 5 days later, Professor said, actually, I'm sorry, I followed up 6 days later because Professor Siegel didn't answer me this time quickly. Previously, he answered me right away. Now, 6 days later, I sent him a follow-up letter. Did you get my email or not? On April 26th. Then on April 27th, Professor Siegel responded, said, a likely motive for the phrasing of Section 61A1 is that Congress saw no need to specify that compensation for service includes wages and salaries because, as you say, those are the most common and obvious forms of compensation for services, whereas the other items are listed because, as you say, they are less common and obvious. Congress therefore wanted to make sure it was understood that those items were included. Okay, this is where the professor is clearly coming from. He claims that wages and salaries are included in compensation for service. And then he asked me, now here are some questions. Are you the Paymon Mutahede associated with Freedom Law School? Has anyone claimed the reward you offer at this page? If so, what happened to those claims? Freedom Law School's $300,000 reward paid. I responded back to the professor, yes, professor. Next, I am the founder and president of Freedom Law School, livefreenow.org. Very few people have attempted to claim any of the $300,000 income tax reward that I have offered since 1999. And I review and evaluate each claim personally and adjudicate them. You seem most qualified to make such a claim if you disagree with Freedom Law School's position on this issue. On your reasoning below, there are two problems with that logic. One, why would Congress take time to define income if it is all income from all sources anyway? With that logic, Section 61 is superfluous. That means it's needless, it's a waste, it's repetition. It is well settled that the law is never superfluous. Two, the argument you forward that salaries and wages must be implied because obviously Congress intended it but did not specifically list wages and salaries cannot be the reason, because the U.S. Supreme Court in the unanimous decision of Gold versus Gold 1917 stated that the obvious that in the, this is a quote not from the court, in the interpretation of taxing statute, it is established well-known rule of law not to extend their provision, extend the tax law by implication, by implying, beyond the clear import of the language used, or to enlarge their operations so as to embrace matters not specifically pointed out. Doubts are resolved against the government. It's time for a break now, Joe.
We're gonna have an intermission, but if you need a minute or two, but basically everybody, we're having a brief intermission. But if Paymon, you need to finish any little last topics, go right ahead.
So this is very clear, folks. You know, the law has to simply point out the statute that imposes the tax, and if there's any doubt, it goes against the government. This is a unanimous Supreme Court, and I told that to his law professor, and I invite him still. If you have another explanation, I would happily give it my most serious consideration legal research and analysis, and be most thankful for you in life. So this is round one. Round two is the continuation of this email with Professor Siegel. Now it's going to get more interesting because Professor Siegel now will make his formal claim to Freedom Law School, and I will rebut that. Should we take an intermission now, Joe?
Yes, please.
Well, the first place to start to understand this particular issue, Joe, flip it back to what you had it on just a second ago, the tax acts defining gross income. And I'll bring up these, until he does that, I'm going to bring up these rules of statutory construction. Let's imagine Congress passes a law. It's going to gradually over time expand it. Well, not Congress, let's call it a legislative body. They're going to pass a law regarding animals. And over time, they intend to add more animals to the list. So let's say that there's a law, a legislative body passes affecting animals. Then animals is defined in the definition section of this law. Would this legislative body say animal mean cat, 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 cat? No, you do not have a repetitive series of words that mean the same thing. That's a rule of statutory construction. The rule of statutory construction is that every word has its own separate independent meaning, separate and apart from the words that surround it. Now let's look at the way Congress has previously defined. Here we've been dealing with Section 61. Let's go back into the old act to see what Congress did in the past in defining gross income. Now, getting back to that illustration about a hypothetical legislative act affecting animals, a legislative body would not come along and say, for the purposes of this act, animal means cat, 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 cat. Okay. Instead, what the law was intended to encompass these things, it would say something like animal means a cat, a dog, a horse, and a cow. And then maybe later on, as time goes by, they might add frogs into the definition of animal. So these are examples of rules of statutory construction. Each word has its own separate independent meaning, and no word means the same thing as the words surrounding. Now let's go take a look at what Congress used in the way of a definition in the past. Here we have, I'm presuming that this is the 1913 Act, that we have Section 2 on the screen. The Act was imposed upon gain, profits, and income. You can see that in Section 2. That, subject to such exemptions and deductions as hereinafter allowed, the net income of a taxable person shall include. So what's tax? Gain, profits, and income. But that gains, profits, and income is derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal service. And that's all we need to cover for purposes of this little video series that we have tonight. That's as much of the definitions of statutory gross income that we need to cover. Now, Joe, let's go down. Let's take a look at 1916. Which is right down below. Ever since then, from 1913 all the way up to the 39 Code, which was in effect until August of 1954, Joe moved down a little. Let's take a look at Section 1200 of the 1916 Act. Again, you can see the same words. Gains, the taxes imposed upon gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal service. Now, let's quickly scroll through. It's at 755 now, Joe. Let's quickly go down the page. That's 1918. Let's go down to 1921 so that our participants can see what the previous act said. Go down to Revenue Act of 1921. There you can see it on the screens. Again, gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal service. Go down to the Revenue Act of 1924. It says the same thing. Now, throughout all these acts, Joe, let's just kind of scroll through so we see that each of these acts use the same definition of gross income. Here on the screen, you can see the Revenue Act of 1924, Section 213, gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal service. Going down to the 1928. It's further down the page, Joe. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, it says the Revenue Act of 1928. Here's the point I want to make. All the way up from 1913 through the Internal Revenue Code of 1939, there was a series of acts that Congress passed. In each of these series of acts that Congress passed, all in lieu of each other, there was a statutory definition of gross income. And it always was described in this fashion. Gross income includes the gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal service. And that's the way it exists all the way up until August of 1954. Now, in August of 1954, Congress passed the 1954 Internal Revenue Code. Today, we got the 1986 Code. If you go back and take a look at the act that established the Internal Revenue Code in 1986, it just said that act just simply says, we changed the name of the 1954 Code to the 86 Code. Well, what is if the 86 Code is the 54 Code, well, what is the 54 Code? The 54 Code is nothing more than the reshuffled 1939 Code. The 1939 Code was the codification, bringing all of the tax acts that were scattered out throughout the United States statutes at large. They stuck them into one act of Congress so that thereafter, instead of amending this section over here and this law dealing with the state and gifts and this section here regarding tobacco taxes and alcohol taxes, blah, 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 they created one act to include all of the tax acts so that thereafter all they had to do was amend one act. And all the way up from 1913 all the way up through August of 1954, when in essence what it's embodied in Section 22 of the 1939 Code, gross income was defined in this fashion. It includes the gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, compensation for personal service. Now, remember, as we analyze that phrase, each word has its own separate independent meaning. It's different from the rest of it. Now, obviously, looking at the statutory definition, income is something entirely different from salary, wages, and compensation for personal service. So just there alone, by means of these old, forgotten by tax professionals, definition of gross income, we can plainly see that there is a difference between income and salaries and wages. Go down to the second page. Here we got Regs 45 for 1980. Go down to the second page, which has the definition of compensation for service. And Joe, what I'd like to do is, just like we did before in reference to the Tax Act, I want to show that there's every time Congress comes out with a Tax Act, the regulations are kind of similar in nature from year to year, and all they do is add to them, they expand and, make things a little bit more clear. Paymon, during the first hour of this program, has shown that he engaged in a series of emails exchanged with Professor Jonathan Siegel, George Washington University. But all Siegel did is, he never mentioned anything about the history act, didn't rely upon it. He probably is completely unfamiliar with the history. But, like that old trite expression that everybody knows about, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. The same thing applies to the tax law. Now, there is a series of tax laws. In 1913, after the 16th Amendment was ratified, allegedly ratified, Bill Benson will say it wasn't ratified, wrote a book about it. In October 1913, pursuant to the 16th, Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1913, the Tariff Act of 1913. In Section 2, they had the income. Now, after the Bruce-Shaver decision in 1916, Congress comes along in October of 19. In response to the Bruce-Shaver case, they repealed the 1913 Act and enacted the 1916 Act. The 1916 Act was amended in 1970. Then starting in 1918, virtually every 2 years, Congress would come along and pass a new income tax. But it was always a tax that was imposed in lieu of the previous tax. Now, you have the Revenue Act of 1918, 21, 24, 26, 28, 32, 34, 36, 38. During whenever those acts were enacted, the Secretary of the Treasury and the Commissioner of Internal Revenue would come out with a set of regulations to implement and enforce each of those acts. So like for the 1916 Act, you had Regs 32. For the 1918 Act, Revenue Act of 1918, you had Regs 45. Then you have 62, goes up to 74. There's a series of regulations, and they're just simply numbers. And in these sets of regulations, they kind of correspond to the various provisions of the Tax Act. So you'll find that in the regulation, there's an expansion of these words. So here Joe's got on the screen the Revenue Act of 1908, and as we can see in Section 213, the tax was imposed upon the gains, profits, and income. But what in reference to salaries and wages, how are they connected to that? But you can see that wages and salaries are the source from which you derive gains, profit. Now, I like to use this example of the operation of something, to use the word derive. A grape is derived from a grapevine. An apple is derived from an apple. Well, in reference to income, income is derived from wages and salaries and compensation for personal service. Now, the commissioner, there were thousands of people employed by the Commissioner of Internal Revenue when the 1916 Act went into effect. When any of these acts, a large number of people. In fact, during the Civil War, there were about 4,800 that were employed in collecting the internal revenue in this country. So, let's say you had 10,000 people that worked for the Commissioner of Internal Revenue in 1916. Well, everybody's got to have a unified, each provision of the Tax Act got to be uniformly construed by everybody that works for the Commissioner of Internal Revenue. And that is the reason why these regs were published. Now, here the commissioner is confronted with this. Here the taxes imposed upon the gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal service. What in the world is compensation for personal service? Well, the commissioner came out, and I think it's Regs 45 here on the screen. Regs 45 for the 1918 Act. 1918 Act. In Article 32, the commissioner defined for everybody inside the Bureau of Internal Revenue. This was the definition of compensation for personal service. Now, let me read it. Where no determination of compensation is had until the completion of the service, the amount received is income for the calendar year of its determination. Commissions paid sales, compensation for services on the basis of percentage profit, commissions on insurance premium, tip, retired pay of federal and other office, and pensions or retiring allowances paid paid by the United States or private person are income to the recipient, as are also marriage fees, baptismal offerings, sums paid for saying masses for the dead, and other gifts and contributions received by the clergy, by a clergyman, evangelist, or religious worker for the services rendered. The salaries of federal officers and employees are subject to tax. But see Article 86. So here you have this first definition of, well, what is in the world is compensation for personal service? Well, compensation for personal service, please remember, wages and salaries were not in the statutory definition, the same as compensation for services. That was something entirely different. So then the definition of compensation for personal service pursuant to the regulations would not include wages and salary. Now, Joe, listen, what I would like to do for the benefit of our people that are watching this video, let's just scroll through the rest of the regulation. Go down to the next page. Okay, Reg 62 for the 21 Act. Now go down to Article 32. And, as you can see, as we go through this process through the remainder of the program, you can see that basically the way the commissioner construed what compensation for personal service meant, it remains basically the same. Now, Joe, okay, there you have Article 32, compensation for personal service. You can compare it, if you're watching this video after this program is over with, you can stop the video and read it. But, here we have Article 32, compensation for personal service, is no different from the definition of compensation for personal services that we had a minute ago in the Revenue Act of 1980. Now, Joe, let's go down to the next page in this doc. Okay, it'll be the next page because that page spilled over into page 221, Treasury Decision 3295. Now, we would need the regulations for the 24 Act, which is the very next page, Joe. Okay, Regulation 65 for the Revenue Act of 1924. Go down to the definition of compensation for services. Okay, Article 32, compensation for personal service. Again, you can compare the old definitions with this new one. Nothing really changes. Where no determination of compensation is had until the completion of the services. Remember, the inherent quality of compensation for personal services, I think, is found in this first line. It's where you have no contract. What you agreed to be paid wouldn't be compensation for service. Compensation for services is whatever is above what you contractually. So, Joe, okay, now we're on Regulation 69 for the 26th Act and go down to the next page. Okay, now Article 32, compensation for personal service. Again, it's the same as the old. Now, hey, Joe, while you move down to the next one, I want to kind of scroll through this because it's very beneficial for our listeners to know that there's a series of these regulations, there's a series of these acts, and you need to take it into consideration what the old stuff said. If you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. So now we have Regulation 74 for the Revenue Act of 1928 on the screen. We can scroll down to the definition of compensation for personal service. It'll be a different section number at a time. Article 52, again, commissions paid salesmen, compensation for services on the basis of percentage of the profits, commissions on insurance premiums, tips, pay a person's. Now you can plainly see, again, this act, that these regulations are construing. The act itself said wages, salaries, and compensation for personal service. So this regulatory definition of compensation for personal services would not include wages and salaries. So, this compensation for personal service, according to the commissioner, is something different from wages and salaries. And so he defines it differently from wages and salaries. Like Joe has outlined here, one example of compensation for personal services, again, that's obvious to me, that would be income. Compensation for services on the basis of a percentage of the profits. The taxes on profits and income are very similar in nature. And so, if you're getting a percentage of income, of course that's going to be income. But, if you go through here, compensation for personal services is entirely different from wages and salary. It's something that people have never thought about. They need to be exposed to these old definitions of compensation for personal services so that they can see, hey, it is different. Now, Joe, go down to the next, what set of regulations we were on. I think we're on the Revenue Act of 1928. I guess this is Revenue Act of 1932, which is probably Reg 77. Yep, there it is on the screen, Reg 77. Revenue Act of 1932, go down to the section, this may be 1.2022- whatever. I think by this time the regulations had to be tied to the section number. In Section 22 of the Revenue Act of 1932, as the 28 Act, Section 22 dealt with the definition of gross income. Oh, we're not there yet. I think that's maybe the next regulation. Article 52, compensation for personal service. Commissions paid salesmen, compensation for services on the basis of percentage of the profits, commissions on insurance premiums, tips, pay a person in the military and naval forces of the United States, retired pay of federal officers. Okay, and pension. Okay, Joe, let's move down to the next. We're at 32, so it'll be Revenue Act of 1934, Regs 86, I guess. Yep. Regs 86 for the 34 Act. Move down to definition of compensation for personal service. Article 22. By this time, now the commissioners direct, hey, for your regulations, connect them to the section in the Income Tax Act. So Section 22 then defined gross income. So Article 22, which is a set of regulations pursuant to Section 2, that are implementing Section 22 or construing Section. So here we have Article 22, paren A-2, defining universally for the people inside that work for the government, work for the Bureau of Internal Revenue. What in the world does compensation for personal service mean? It means commissions paid salesmen, compensation for services on basis of percentage of the profits, blah, blah, blah. Okay, let's move on to, we're at 34. I think 36 is the next one. You moving down the page, Joe?
Sure am.
Good enough.
Everything west of the Mississippi.
Yep. Okay, Regs 94 for the 36 Act. This is from the Federal Register. The Federal Register, the first issue was March of 96. So in the same year as the first issue, Volume 1, Federal Register. Now here you have the table of contents. We can see it on the screen. You can see Section 22 on the screen. Gross income, general definition. And then they have Article 22A1, what is included in gross income. And 22A2 defines compensation for personal service. So let's go down to that definition, Joe. And our viewers will be able to see that it basically does not change, and it's something different from wages and salary, because still in the Revenue Act of 1934, Section 22 read, gross income means it includes the gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, or compensation for personal service. And here we have, again, on the screen, compensation for personal service, commissions paid salesmen, compensation for services on the basis of a percentage of profit, commissions on insurance premiums, tips, pay of person, military and naval forces of the United States, retired pay of federal and other officers, and pensions or retiring allowances paid by private person or by the United States are income. Now let's go on down. Here we are at Revenue Act 36. That was Regs 86, I think. So 38 Act would be Regs 101. Should be on the screen, Joe. Real slow. Okay, Regs 101, right. For the Revenue Act of 1938. Now let's go down to Section 22A-2. And for the benefit of our listeners, if you want to get all of these regulations, you can go over to my website. I got two websites. One of which is Dixieland Law Journal. Now it's on my ISP, so use an internet search engine, just type in Dixieland Law Journal, and a link will come up to go over to my website. Now, when you get to the front page of my website, go down to the link, the page called Taxation, and click on that. And all of the old tax acts and all of the old regulations are there, and they can be downloaded. And you can do that. You can confirm the accuracy of what we're showing. In fact, what we have on the screen comes from that website. But here we have Article 22, compensation for personal service, and it reads just like the old ones. Now, Joe, let's quickly go on to the next, which would be Regs 103 for the 39 code. Now, when you get over to my website, that taxation page, you can download all of the old tax act and all of the old regulations. They are PDF images that are word searchable. So, if you download Regs 101, which happens to be a page which is on the screen, you can type in, do a word search for compensation, and, you'll hit section Article 22A2. Okay, we need to go down, not the next page, but the page after that, Joe, to Regs 103 for the 39 code. Here we go. Again, as I've stated previously, as time goes by, the regs basically remain the same. As you've seen from this review of the regulatory definition of compensation for personal service, what does Commissioner think that that word or that phrase mean? He defines it in this set of regulations, and you'll find it in section 19-22. As time goes by, they had different parts for the 39 code. Going down here to 19.22A-2, compensation for personal service. Commissions paid salesmen, compensation for services based on a percentage of the profit. All of our listeners, all of our viewers can see it remains the same. So here's the point I want to make. The Supreme Court has been required in the litigation come before it there's been litigation on let's call it section 22, even though it's, the older acts had different sections, but there was a statutory definition of gross income from 1913 all the way up to the 39 code. Now, in reference to those definitions, statutory definition of gross income, the Supreme Court has said that description is the perfect description of the reach and scope of Congress's power to tax income pursuant to the 16th Amendment. Today, if you take a look at Section 61, it says gross income means all. That doesn't tell you a whole lot. And then it lists some items. And of course, Jonathan Siegel would want you to infer the wages and salaries are included in compensated personal service. But let's go back to the old stuff, which is, in my basic position, is the history. The old stuff is really important. And if you don't know that history, you're doomed to repeat it, and you're going to miss a whole lot of the meaning of law. But if you go back to the old stuff from which Section 61 was derived, the Congressional Committee reports say Section 1 of the 54 Code was derived from Section 22 of the 39 Code. They both mean the same thing. Well, the Supreme Court has said that Section 22 is a great description of the reach and scope of the Congress's power to tax incomes pursuant to the 16th Amendment. If that be the case, then pursuant to the Supreme Court's approval of Section 22 definition of gross income, then there is a distinction between income and wages and salary. And there is also a distinction between wage, salary, and compensation for personal service. Now, I want to end with this. We're almost to the end of this program. I think we ought to have a few questions before we part. Don't you think so, Joe? But, this issue of whether or not wages or income was an issue that was raised decades ago in the late 70s and early 80s. A bunch of people went running to court. They read a book, Are You Required?, which laid out a very simplistic argument that wages are not income, and people have gone to court to raise that issue. And one of the things that was never raised in those cases is this history of a statutory definition of gross income, which tells you a great deal. The Supreme Court has said the Section 22 definition of gross income, wow, that's a great description of the reach and scope of Congress's power to tax income. And income is defined as including the gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal service. And just from those words and that string of words that you'll find in Section 22, which is a great description of Congress's power to tax pursuant to the 16th Amendment, you can plainly see that there's a difference between income and salaries and wages.
Absolutely.
And compensation for personal services.
Maybe,
and then
Sean,
compensation for personal services is something entirely different from wages and salary. And then Paymon's point is that when Section 61 starts out with compensation for personal services, why in the world didn't Congress include salaries and wages? That's a very interesting question. And to say that salaries and wages are included there means that you have to imply them. And Paymon's point is, the Supreme Court says you can't apply.
Hey, Sean, did you have any comment you wanted to add?
At this time, no. Larry's a real hard act to follow. I mean, when you cover the regulations,
we have to move through a lot, Sean.
And you go through the history of it, and you go through the regulation, and you look at the commissioner's interpretation of the statutes, which even I will question it sometimes. They are the commissioner's interpretation. And it's pretty clear. When you go through Section 61 and the history of it, 22 through 61, and you go through the regulations, that there is absolutely a difference between compensation for services, wages and salaries, and income. If there wasn't, as Larry keeps telling us, they would never have been listed separate. More so to the professor, they would have been encompassed under one thing, compensation for services. You would never have seen wages and salaries. You never would have seen income. It would have just been compensation for services, leaving the rest of us in the world to say, well, gee, I guess that's what they didn't do that.
Hey, Sean, you're right. Most people, when asked, what does compensation for services mean? Hey, that's everything that I bring in. That's my wage and a salary. However, Commissioner said long ago, and for a long period of time, that they're different from wages and salary. And the statute so said.
Right. And that was that's the exact point, Larry, through the whole thing, is that they made a distinction. And we all know, and if the listeners maybe not so, but the legislature never uses terms they do not need to use within a statute. If they use it on purpose, and they use it for a reason.
So true.
I might just point out that, don't have a law degree, didn't ever pass the bar, and never been a professor at a law school, but would it be too critical to say that a law professor would certainly know how to do research, and rather than, in the case of Professor Siegel, claim that he could basically read the mind of Congress. Isn't there a process, Larry?
Well, there is, Joe. Just that idea alone conflicts with what the Supreme Court said.
Right.
Implication. In reference to the tax laws, there's no room for implications. That was the point that Paymon was making.
Well, right. And the professor was basing law upon assumption. I've never really heard that rule.
Absolutely.
Somebody please enlighten me.
Which I would just point out here at the tail end that, Paymon, you drew out Professor Siegel with your initial question. And it illustrates how important it is for each and every one of us. Of course, the little more studying that you do, the little more you will be prepared, but how critical it is to reach out and ask questions, because that's what Paymon did. He asked a question. I was joking, in law enforcement, we have something called officer stupid, which is another way of saying the Columbo approach, where you ask a question that you may know the answer to, you may not, but you want to find out what the person you're asking knows and where they get their information from. So be officer stupid in the sense, or be Columbo in the sense of, you want to ask questions of these people that claim to be experts. And I don't, no aspersions cast against Professor Siegel, but, a little bit of research, a little bit of fact finding. But the problem is, when you do a little bit of research and a little bit of fact finding, you end up like the four guys on your screen, okay? Because once you
And
start...
Professor Siegel, Joe, promised. I talked to him a few weeks ago. He told me by end of August he wants to get back with me because he didn't get my denial letter, he says. So we'll see. Let me follow up to this down. We'll let you guys know how it develops further.
Well, Paymon, send him a copy of this video.
Yes, he'll get it.
We
he can lay it out in black and white in a letter.
Yes, well, we are just about out of time, so I would encourage people to go to incometaxripoff.org, agentfortruth.com, SeanO'Connor.org, livefreenow.org. A couple of the other co-hosts that weren't able to join us tonight, Dave Wellington, Jim White of Northwest Liberty News. We continue to try to get more material on incometaxripoff.org. We're trying very hard to get you as much information as we can. We're going to have this video archived very soon, and we'll try to provide you all the links and information that we can in the coming weeks and months. So your job is to do your homework, right, guys?
Right.
Yes, Joe.
All right. Well, we'll see you again.
And you have been a great host tonight, Joe.
Yes.
Thanks. See everybody again for show number 4. Tell your friends. We'll all see you later. Take care. Bye-bye.